It's great to see so much interest tonight in native plants. I've got a lot of material here, so don't hesitate to ask questions at the end. I'm going to break my talk up into 4 different pieces. I'm going to start out with a little bit of history, and I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but I want to be very clear in terms of why I'm moving forward and why our program is moving forward in the way we are. I want to get you thinking about different ideas or opportunities for native landscaping that's out there. We're going to get into urban design and urban management. And if you have worked already on larger scale properties or on a farm where you've done some conversion to natives, we're going to talk about some of the nuances that we see and lessons learned, sometimes the hard way, in our urban areas. And then finally, we're going to finish up because the state of Iowa does have some funding opportunities for you to do some conversion of turf to natives. If we could travel back in time and look at Iowa and be on the landscape when the land surveyors came across the state, we would have obviously found a much different landscape. We know this because not only did the landscapers mark legal descriptions, but they also recorded what sort of vegetation that they saw on the land. The yellow is the prairie, and you can see that's the dominant vegetation that the land surveyors found. The green were our forests, and those tended to be concentrated up in northeast Iowa and along our stream and river corridors. And then the pink, those are our wetlands. Iowa had a lot of wetlands. But if you look close up in north central Iowa, you can see where the last glacier came through the Des Moines Lobe, and there were a lot of wetlands there. Obviously, today we have a much changed landscape. Iowa is a very strong agricultural state. And a big part of that is because of the soils that were formed under our prairie. We also have some urban centers. If we look at land use, this is a land use map. It's a little dated, it's from 2012. And I don't know if you can pick that out with the light, but there's a lot of gray on the map. And that's where row crop production is. The yellow are our grasslands. The green are our forests. In Iowa, we're about 10% urban right now. Only about 10. So the bulk of the state is still in prime agriculture. If we were to travel back in time again, this is more of what Iowa would have looked like. Our woodland areas, especially here in southern Iowa, we would have had scattered oak and hickory trees. And there would have been enough sunlight that could reach the forest floor, and so we would have had a very diverse herbaceous layer. Many different species, flowering species, grasses. Today, a lot of our wetlands, or a lot of our woodlands, especially in our urban areas, they're dominated with invasive species. So we have a lot of invasive honeysuckle, autumn olive, a lot of those species. And what happens is there's not a lot of sunlight that can reach the forest floor. So then we lose our herbaceous native native plants. One of the other changes that we've seen in Iowa is the loss of our wetlands and the straightening of our streams. One of the things that you probably notice that when it rains, our streams, the water levels are very flashy. It raises very high in our streams, and then after a while, it gets lower. This is very hard on our stream banks. As we've added hard surfaces, roads, buildings, that also has made it difficult for water to soak into the ground. One of the things that we know is that as we add impervious surface, so as we add roads, as we add buildings, that starts to impact the biological characters in our water quality. Even at only 1 or 2%, we can see impairments. And when we get to watersheds that are up to 15% impervious, we start to see serious degradation of water. So even though Iowa is only about 10% urban, we really do need to pay attention to the runoff from our urban areas. So historically then, The bulk of our water, when it rained, it was soaked into the ground or it was evaporated. We had very little runoff. Today we kind of flip-flop. We still have evaporation, but we only have about 15% of that water that actually moves into the ground, and the rest is runoff. So with our urban program, what we're really trying to do is to reconnect with our prairie heritage. And so I want you to know that bias of why we are moving in the direction we are with our urban practices and from a water quality and flood reduction standpoint. So anytime we can, when we're looking at our urban practices, we're trying to plant natives. It improves water quality, it reduces runoff, but also, as you know, if we build it, they will come. And so we will see our songbirds, we will see our pollinators, we will see our dragonflies and our butterflies. The natives provides a food source, habitat, and also it can repel the Canada geese. As humans, we also get benefits, and this helps our health. It also, long-term, can reduce maintenance costs. So this is a cross-section of a prairie, and you're probably all aware, everybody here has probably walked through a prairie before. You know that there's a diverse number of grasses and flowers, which we call forbs. You might have some scattered trees, but there's a lot of different plants that are out there. What you might not know is what it looks like underneath the ground. If you've done gardening, which I know a lot of you have been working in your yards, if you think about how shallow the root system of sod is, it's a couple inches. When we look at the root system of native prairie, what these measurements or these increments on the right side of the scale show, it's very common to have root systems for prairie that are 5 foot deep. And if you look at this chart, we also have several that are even deeper than 10 feet. So the prairie and the development of our soil is why we have some of the best soils in the world, and that's why we are the agricultural state that we are. Our prairie soils had 8 to 10% organic matter. To put it into perspective, most soils today have less than 4% organic matter. And when we come into urban areas, especially new development, we have far less. So what this means is, because we've lost the organic matter in our soil, we've lost the ability to absorb water. Our soils were a sponge, and that's what we're trying to recreate. As a rule of thumb, for every % of organic matter we can absorb about 0.6 inches of rain. So if we put that in perspective, if we had a 6-inch rain, when we had 8 to 10% organic matter, our soils could have absorbed that water. Today, we have trouble with our soils have trouble handling 1.25 inches of rain. So with our urban program, we're trying very hard to look at practices to be able to increase the health of the soil and to absorb the water. Okay, so that's history. You know my bias, okay? What I want to do next is get you thinking about different places where you can plant natives. So, already in the state, we have corporate campuses that are starting to convert their turf to natives. We're seeing parks bring in natives. We're seeing colleges and schools plant natives. We're seeing homeowners associations convert their turf, their open spaces, to natives. We're seeing yards from homeowners, and we're seeing commercial areas convert. There are a lot of different places that are starting to integrate natives. This is a master plan that was developed for the Iowa Economic Development Authority and Iowa Finance Authority in Des Moines. They have been a huge supporter of urban conservation and water quality and flood reduction efforts in the state, and they wanted to walk the talk with their own campus. So they've integrated wetlands, rain gardens, and native landscaping. Here are some outlots in some homeowners associations that have converted to natives. You can see the butterfly milkweed there. We're converting areas along ponds and along streams to natives. We're doing a lot of stream restoration, trying to reconnect our streams to our floodplains and bring back the natives. We're planting them along trails. We're working on property buyouts, areas that used to flood a lot. This area here was full of homes, and now it's the beginning of a prairie. We're seeing plantings along ponds, especially important if that pond or that lake has bacterial impairments from geese. Geese like to see their predators. They love mowed turf. And if we can raise that vegetation above their eye height, which is about 18 inches, then we can help deter them and take away their favorite places. We're doing a lot of work, native plantings with wetlands, not only along the perimeter, but we're integrating our wet species in the interior of wetlands. And then we're also converting our stormwater dry detention areas. A lot of what I do is work on practices, infiltration-based practices that catch that rain and help it to move into the soil profile. We're working very closely with natives in swales and drainage ways, so rather than putting that water in a pipe where we just send it downstream, we can't treat, once it gets in that pipe, we can't treat the water from a water quality perspective, and we can't reduce the water from a flooding perspective. And so we're working with bioswales and then putting in natives. Here's a before and after of a project that we did in Scott County in the Davenport area. We're doing a lot of work with rain gardens, collecting that roof water from your gutters and your downspouts and directing it to a small depression. And here's a rain garden in North Liberty. And we're working very closely with landscapers and landscape designers so that not only do they function for water quality and flood reduction, but they also look pretty too. In some areas where we're have parking lots that we have to deal with the runoff, we're looking at bioretention cells. They're very similar to rain gardens, but we help out the drainage a bit with having amended soil and having rock underneath the soil, underneath the mulch layer. Here's a recent bioretention cell that we did in Oskaloosa, and this was put in place at the USDA office, and it was designed to just handle the water that was running off the parking lot. Here's one that we did at Hospice in Washington County, on the edge of town. We're doing some native plantings. This is a native planting that was done in the Amana colonies at the Hotel Millwright. One of the things that the Amana colonies did was restore the old mill, and they paid close attention to restoring, preserving the architecture of the buildings. But they also paid attention to the landscaping, and they came back in with native plants. We worked really closely with the landscape designer on this, and so you'll see that there's blocks of plantings. Sometimes that's a technique that's used in gardening, to use the same plant in one area. And that's something that we've used. We've learned that we need to look at the shorter growing plants, so we looked at shorter growing plants for this site. This is a native planting at the Grinnell Library. So we are seeing libraries adopt native plants as well. We're also doing a bit of work, not a lot, but a bit of work with green roofs. And this is a green roof where they use native landscaping. on the top. And so imagine if you're in a hospital with a serious illness, or you're visiting a family member that has a serious illness, if you have an opportunity to look out at a roof that actually has plants on it and has butterflies and birds. And so we're seeing some of that as well. We have brand new design standards online in the Iowa Stormwater Management Manual that are specifically for urban plantings. The next part of my talk, what I want to do is get into the project design and talk a little bit about some of the differences that we're seeing in urban settings. One of the first things we have to pay attention to is what is the scale of the project? Are we looking at converting a small area in a yard? Are we looking at a stream corridor that has a lot of acres of plantings? Are we looking at an area of a pond, around a pond? And so all of those sites, we might tackle the design in a little bit different way. A lot of our urban plantings, we are using live plants, either plugs or pots. We also are using seed mixes. In a larger area, we would use a seed mix. But in a smaller area, it can be cost effective to use live plants. And here's an example of a project that was done at a residential site where they came in and they used some potted plants. And one of the things that does is if we can use the live plants, it really helps us jumpstart the native process. If you've worked with native plants before and native seed mixes, you know it can take several years for establishment. And so when we're getting into these urban settings that are smaller, if we can go with live plants, we're trying to do that just to speed up the process. One of the next things that I wanted to do is to share some of the design things that we ask about during the process. So if you were interested in doing a native planting in your yard, some of the things that we would start right off with is, you know, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? Where is the area that you want to plant? What does that area look like in relationship to where your house is placed, or where maybe some trees are, or where the sidewalks are? We want to know what's the square footage, what's the acreage. We look at, is the area to be converted? Is it sod? Is it a new building area where there's maybe still row crops? Because that all makes a difference in how we move forward. We look at your soils and we keep it simple. Are your soils wet? Are they in between, or are they dry? We look at the slope. Is it flat? Is it gently sloping? Is it steep? You know, we're trying to keep this process simple. How much sunlight do you get? The same questions that you might ask if you're designing a traditional garden. Is it sunny? Is it shady? Or is it in between? And then we start getting into what kind of plants are you interested in? What kind of seed mix? And we have some resources back there that give you ideas for different type of plants, different species, because there's so many to choose from. We look at the layout of the plants, and then in particular what we look at is the border. And that's probably one of the biggest things that, and I will come back to that a little bit, but having a border is probably one of the biggest lessons learned that I want to share about the urban design. Okay, so I want to go through lessons learned, and yes, some of these have been learned the hard way, but I want to pass along our experiences so you don't have the same mistakes, okay? For our urban sites, we are focusing on smaller, shorter plants. The tall grass prairie, some of those species can get 8 foot tall. That is not what we're looking for in a lot of these smaller residential plantings. We're trying to keep our grasses and flowers someplace below 4 foot or less, okay? We want to be able to see over them. We have sample mixes available. If you're going to use a mix instead of going with live plants, we have some sample mixes that you can try. Block plantings make a big difference. Planting the same species and then moving to another area of your yard and having another block. In our smaller plantings, there are some species that are just too aggressive. They might do wonderful in a large-scale planting, but when we break that site down and include that mix in a small area, that aggressive plant might take over the entire planting. And so we're looking very closely at the species that are being used. We're also paying attention to the equipment and not only from the planting perspective, but from the maintenance side. What do you physically have access to? We don't want to forget that there are city ordinances out there. And a lot of times there's a city ordinance that might prohibit plants above 10 inches of height. And so that's something that we have to work through. And then finally, the border. And I want to show you an example of a border. With all of our prairie plantings, we're trying to have a mowed strip along like sidewalks so we don't have the prairie flopping over onto the sidewalk. So people feel safe walking next to a taller vegetated area. The border can provide that sense of, okay, there's a plan to this. People can say, okay, I look at that in the plantings and I can tell that something different is supposed to be going on there, making it purposeful. A lot of our borders can also serve as fire breaks, and we might not be burning in our urban areas, but if we have large amounts of natives, we want to think about unplanned fires and being able to respond to that. One of the other lessons learned that we're sharing is that natives have a little bit different time frame when you would seed them compared to other grasses. We seed them in the spring. We seed them in the fall, late fall. But we don't seed them during the summer. There's a different life cycle there. Okay, the next thing I want to cover, a big lesson that we want to share, is when you're getting ready to plant natives, there's some seed bed prep that you have to do. Your turf in your yard is not compatible with natives. There are two different life cycles there. Your turf is a cool season grass. The natives are warm season. You may have some cool season natives in your mix, but we have to make sure that before you do any planting of natives that your existing turf is dead, okay? Otherwise, those cool season, your turf gets a huge head start and it out-competes. If you're running a race, you would think everybody would start at the same point. But when it comes to cool season and natives, your cool seasons start to warm up in the spring, in March when we get our first warm weather, get our first rains. The natives, they don't start to green up until April and May. And so they always outcompete, and that's why we have to have that existing turf gone. So you might be thinking, all right, well, how do I get rid of that sod? There are a lot of different ways. There's not necessarily one right way, but we know we have to take care of that sod. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna choose the method that fits your goals, your beliefs, your site conditions, your budget, and the equipment that you have available, okay? There are many different options, and I'm not going to debate the different options that are out there, but I do want you to know that there are different ones to choose from. You can use a sod cutter and physically come in and remove the sod with equipment and the roots. You can smother the sod with cardboard or a tarp. You can use multiple passes of tillage. So there are a lot of different options there that you can use. But we know with a seed bed, we want it to make sure it's firm. We don't want you sinking in the soil when you're out there before you plant. And another big thing is that seeding is going to be shallow, only 1/4 inch deep. So it's really a shallow seeding. Some of the equipment, if you're going to do planting with live plants, obviously you're going to do that by hand, and you might have a hand trowel. A lot of times we'll do a shredded hardwood mulch and then plant in the live plants. If you're going to do a seed mix, we might broadcast that by hand and then rake it in, or maybe we would use a drill and harrow in that seed. And here's just an example of a larger urban planting where they came in and they planted it, and then they used a roller to roll that seed in. Here's a little pocket prairie that we did up at Northeast Iowa Community College. Both of their campuses in Kelmer and Piasta, they converted, at the Piasta campus, they wanted their islands in their parking lots to be something more than just turf. So this is this was done this past year, where they came in and they got rid of the existing vegetation. They put down shredded mulch, and they came in and they planted and they watered and they weeded. And so they have several islands out there that are now natives. They also, at their Kelmer campus, they converted several of their green space areas to pocket prairies. So we see some of these colleges that are also trying to take some of the sod and convert it to natives. Sometimes, depending on the scale of the project, and this wouldn't necessarily maybe be the case for a homeowner, but we do have to make sure that we're not contributing to erosion down the road. Okay, the next bit I want to talk about is establishment and maintenance. If you can see the sign, it says free weeds. We can't plant our prairies and walk away from them. They will be less maintenance over time, but that doesn't mean no maintenance, okay? The more we can do during the first 2 years after we seed a prairie, the better chance we're gonna have at having a great stand out there. And so when we seed prairies, we're gonna encourage you to actively mow that first year after. You're gonna mow high. You're going to need a mower, though, that you can raise the deck to at least 6 inches. And so this is one of the things we talk about in terms of what you have access to for equipment. Most of the mowers that we have in our garage, we can't raise that high. But we can use weed trimmers, and that's another option for a smaller native planting. There's going to be a lot of mowing the first year after a prairie, and even some the second year. And then hopefully by the 3rd year, you've got a prairie that's looking pretty good, and then we can look at some other options for long-term maintenance. If you're planting live plants, you're going to look at mulching, watering, and weeding as your main establishment. This is a project that we did in Bettendorf, where we had a condo association that was really interested in converting some of their turf to natives, and we started in the spring of 2023 with to get rid of the existing sod. There wasn't any prairie seed that was planted until the spring of 2024. We were very patient to make sure that that existing sod was completely dead before we began planting, and that is critical. The condo representative, John DeTay, who worked on this project, was just outstanding. He was out every month with a weed trimmer, trimming the prairie the first year after it was done. And this is the result. I mean, it was just an amazing planting, probably one of the best plantings that I've seen. But they did it, they went through the process, and of course we got rain too. So all those things kind of fell in line. But they were patient before they planted, made sure they had good seedbed prep, and then they followed through with the weed trimming. On our larger projects, one of the things that we're starting to do is actually have a separate contract for establishment. And so not only is there a contract for the planting and some funding going into planting, but there's also a contract for the 2 years after that seeding goes into place, and we're finding some good success with that on our larger projects. Okay, to start wrapping up, one of the other key lessons learned is adding signage, so people know that we're doing something different. We've got some signs here. One that we're using a lot, Prairie in Progress. Be patient with us. Another one that we have is just a native landscaping sign. These are smaller signs so that for our residential plantings, as people were walking by on the sidewalk, if we can sign it and let people know, please be patient with us, there's something coming here, there's a purpose to what we're doing. On our larger projects, there's obviously some bigger signage that's going on, but we're finding signage helps. And then lastly, I want to wrap up with just talking about some funding. We are seeing more and more of a push and more support financially to help offset the costs of getting natives established. And so if that's something, you know, if the cost is an issue that's maybe being preventative in terms of you doing some conversion from turf to natives, then we can talk about that, because there are some funding opportunities, several different ones that are out there for both small scale projects as well as much larger projects. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop. You all have been so attentive. Thank you.